health knowledge transfer and update, and has been an implementation researcher for over 30 years. He is one of the editor-in-chiefs of Trials. During COVID, he has led 2 initiatives, COVID End, a network of 50 evidence synthesis organizations that aim to encourage cooperation and collaboration and reduce duplication in evidence synthesis response due to COVID, and Bessie, which aims to promote research into behavioral, environmental, social, and system interventions to reduce COVID transmission and mitigate the effects of the pandemic. And as a colleague and a friend, thank you, Dr. Grimshaw, for being here.
Thanks a lot, Jenny. I'm just going to share the screen, so that'll just take probably a minute or so to sort out. But while I'm doing that, I'd like to thank the organisers of the conference in terms of their invitation. It's actually the first time in probably about 2 or 3 months I've worn a shirt with a collar. So thank you for giving me a reason to dress up slightly fancy today. The screen is just loading. Can I just double check that you can see that at the moment, Jenny?
Yes, we're all good. Thanks, Jeremy.
Good, okay, and then I'm going to do that so I can't see myself. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to send you greetings from Canada. In this weird post-COVID, COVID world, I've stepped out of a peer review peer review panel for the DFG funder that is currently happening in Berlin, or virtually, but from Berlin. So the Brandenburg Gate. But at the moment, I'm physically located in the wonderful city of St. John's in Newfoundland, Canada. And this is the view of the harbour from Signal Hill. And it's a very wonderful and COVID-safe environment to be in. So I was very delighted when I was looking at the evidence-based research website to see the kind of the quotation from Isaac Newton that we see further if we stand on the shoulders of giants. And so this is one of my giants, Adrian Grant, who was the director of the Health Services Research Unit from the mid-90s, and I had the great fortune of being one of his, or working with him and being mentored by him. And basically, Adrian, predating evidence-based research, taught me that research requires us to do 4 things: ask the most important and relevant questions, learn from what we already know, design robust, ambitious research, interpret your findings in the context of the global knowledge base, and then iterate as necessary. And actually, I think that is very much the embodiment of the evidence-based research movement. So what's happening now in relation to COVID and trying to basically conduct high-quality evidence-based research? Well, I think the pandemic raises a number of challenges for us. The first relates to the novel nature of the virus. Before the pandemic struck, we had no COVID-19 specific data to help guide future research. So the idea that we could systematically view previous research to inform future research was challenged. But we did have COVID relevant research. There's a lot of research on other coronaviruses, such as SARS or MERS, and also research on, say, behavioral approaches in infectious disease outbreaks that could be levered to both help thinking about guiding policy and practice in the first few days, but also then to think about planning for future research and what was needed. And I argue that probably we've made as much a lot of the progress that we have, in particular because of the COVID relevant research that predated the pandemic. So the novel nature of the virus, I think, sets up unique challenges. It's very rare for us to be in a situation in healthcare where there isn't a lot of prior knowledge that we need to plan forward from. A second issue was just the rapid spread. So the 1st of December, the symptoms in the index case were started on the 1st of December 2019. By the 11th of March in 2020, when WHO declared the pandemic, there were 118,000 cases in 114 countries. And at that time, I was actually a visiting professor in Galway, Ireland, and you could see the pandemic, basically working its way across the globe and causing a huge amount of concern and major challenges in countries, such as China, Italy, Spain, as they grappled with the first wave of the pandemic. And now, if we move forward to today, we have over 55 million cases, and we have cases reported in all countries in the world except for 9 countries. 2 of those we're not sure about, North Korea, but the others tend to be very small Pacific Island states. So this truly, within the space of less than a year, has been an epidemic that is, or pandemic that has become global in nature. And that also made real challenges because, often this was rolling out and in a matter of weeks it would leap from Italy to other countries, which also meant that it's very hard to learn as we're moving forward because often countries in the first wave were still going through their very deep learning phase, whilst other countries were suddenly being affected. So again, this was a relatively unique perspective. But how did we respond from that? Well, there's a dramatic increase in research funding. So the Research Investments in Global Health Study, RESIN, which is based out of the University of Southampton in the UK, has today tracked that there's been $3.3 billion worth of funding globally to try and address the pandemic. And if you actually, the epicenter in the UK has a COVID-19 living map of evidence, and this also gives you a sense of how the evidence base has dramatically developed over a relatively short period of time. So if you go back to the 20th of March, they identified 2 publications related to treatment outcome, 109 towards transmission, 115 case studies, and only 3 looking at social impact. But by the 30th of October, which is when they had the last update, you can see that there had been a dramatic increase in treatment outcome, transmission, case studies, and social impact. So again, this raises issues about how do we both use research to plan future research in the space during the time of a pandemic, but also how do we make sense of this? Because the information is changing so rapidly that it becomes hard to basically sort of keep on top of it, so it can help you plan future research and interpret your current research. And then the final issue, I think, is we've had unparalleled intense public and media scrutiny. It's it's like science is on trial day by day. If we're lucky, we get publication by preprint or by press release. Notably, the 2 announcements about vaccines in the last sort of 2 weeks have all been done by press release, and we still haven't had a chance to look at the data. There seems to be within the media, a single study focus. So people are often sort of picking up a single study and really sort of often investing in that single study a level of trustworthiness that is probably not justified given what the study was done. And particularly for a lot of the transmission studies, where you may have a report from, say, a single train journey or a single plane journey, I think we need to see these as being individual case studies. And what we need to know is whether the kind of the factors in transmission that appear in one of those case studies are replicated as we move forward. But it's been very hard, I think, in the public glare to actually be able to sort of say, well, actually the way science, all science is imperfect, and the way science advances is by, basically replication, extending studies to allow us to say across a range of imperfect studies, this is what we think might be worthwhile. And one of the major journals, I think it's Nature or Science, talked about dueling anecdotes, basically people pulling one anecdote to justify their position and other people pulling another anecdote in a way that, given the time pressures and the media intensity of the pandemic, we don't normally see in science. So those have all been challenges. And I think one of the things it's done is create this amazing noise to signal problem. both in the scientific but also in the non-scientific sort of sectors, which means it's very hard to think about how we can, if you like, efficiently and thoughtfully plan future research and learn from research when there's just so much going on. So what I want to do is this is not a comprehensive survey, but it's a personal reflection of things that I've come across in the last 8 months, and that I think sort of highlight some of the issues, but also what have been, good practices or good experiences, what have been bad and what have been ugly. So this is the good, the bad, and the ugly in the time of COVID. And I'm not sure whether that is Lee Van Cleef or Clint Eastwood. You'll have to decide that for yourself. So what has been good? One of the reasons that I think we have made so much progress in the pandemic is that globally there was a lot of preparatory work done before the pandemic. So in 2016, the WHO created an R&D blueprint as a global strategy and preparedness plan to rapidly activate research and development activities during epidemics, focusing on tests, vaccines, medicines that could be used to save lives and avert large-scale crises. And the WHO's leadership in this led to a number of other initiatives that, if you like, we have significantly benefited from. One of these is the CEPI initiative, the Coalition of Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. And this was established in 2017, influenced and enabled to some extent by the WHO blueprint. And that basically made the case that we need to be working in the basic science labs to try and identify viruses and vaccine candidates for high-risk viruses. And although they weren't aware of COVID-19, two of the viruses that they worked upon were SARS and MERS, that are both coronaviruses. And my guess is that that has helped a lot when we've been trying to think about how we can handle COVID-19, and also working to be ready to go into the field when a pandemic or an epidemic outbreaks. So this one of the key messages that I think I'm going to take from this is the more that we can prepare outside of pandemics, the more we're going to make rapid gains in terms of science to address pandemics when they occur. And this came across, I just put this in because it came across my Twitter timeline today, but a lovely little video from University of Oxford that basically outlines some of the sort of the issues and reasons why, basically Oxford, with other groups around the world, were able to very quickly start to identify and develop and test candidate vaccines. So we have been fortunate by the work that has been done in the last 5 to 10 years, that has meant that even though the pandemic is awful, we've made fairly rapid progress, which we would not have done if we hadn't had these kind of initiatives. Another thing that I think has really supported the scientific response is in some countries there has been significant investment in research infrastructure. And here I want to, in particular, highlight the work of the National Institute of Health Research in the UK that has, I think, over the last decade and a half, professionalized clinical trials in the UK, made them standard part of care in the NHS. I think a few years ago, Rory Milne tweeted out that either all or 97% of hospitals in the UK were involved in recruiting patients for trials, and there's an infrastructure in hospitals to do that. And also the NHR has established clinical trial units that have very high levels of expertise in the design, planning, conduct, and analysis of research, as well as sort of patient partnerships embedded as part of that. Another thing that the NHR has done is create the NHR Academy. And again, that seems to me one of the things that is done in the UK is create this idea of community in the applied health field, that actually we are all part of working for, or the scientists in the UK are all trying to do the best to sort of support decision-making in the NHS, which also means there's a high level of preparedness to collaborate, preparedness to work together, and also to think about this not just from a small institutional basis, but actually what is it that the population needs to move forward. So I think examples such as the WHO blueprint, CEPI, and then the kind of investments that NHR has made really have helped us. And unfortunately, they're not sort of standard across the world. I think the NHR is probably pretty unique in the level of thoughtful architecture it's put in place to support research. So, and now I need to apologize for mixing my movie metaphors, but I want to talk about the ugly and the bad in RCTs, and they're the kind of usual suspects, but worse than usual. So if you look at the majority of studies that have been registered, they have small, inadequate sample sizes. So they have sample sizes that are unlikely to lead to any sort of trustworthy estimate of the effects of whatever interventions they are testing. There's also an issue that in many of these small or institutions that are doing these small studies, it's actually interfering with the ability to recruit into larger studies. So there's almost a sort of interference of doing sort of small local projects when we should be trying to collaborate at a larger scale and with greater or with international studies. And there's a lack of standardized reporting. Cochrane has created a COVID-19 study register, and they, by today, had something like 2,600 randomized controlled trials tagged. But only 12.8% of those have death as an outcome, 8.7% have mechanical ventilation, and then there are 78 other outcomes listed. Now, some of these are not necessarily drug treatments, so it's kind of highly likely that some of those outcomes and variability is appropriate given the range of interventions that are being tested. But it feels as though we're back into the idea of basically the wild west of outcome reporting, with people doing trials using their own outcomes, which will actually hinder our ability to meta-analyze them in the future. And we know very little about the conduct, the ethics, or reporting of trials in this space at the moment. But at the I worry that it's not going to be better than usual, and it's probably going to be potentially worse than usual given the constraints that people are working under. This is a slide, or these are slides that my colleague Paul Glasziou in Australia has produced, and it just shows, again, using the Cochrane COVID-19 register. There's a huge range of in terms of the number of trials for any one intervention, and if you want to, I mean, the world seems to have been able to bet on a loser, because by far the biggest number of trials being done were in hydroxychloroquine, which we know, largely is ineffective in relation to COVID, and much less in terms of other interventions. And again, if you think about it, what would we like? My guess is we'd actually like quite a medium number of large-scale trials for any one intervention to help us understand what its values are. One of the other issues is that there's actually poor coverage of some areas. So we would argue that the pandemic has been held to what it is already, largely because of behavioral, environmental, social, and systems interventions for pandemic preparedness. But if you look at trials that have been registered, only about 8 out of 1,300 trials actually address those issues. So we have a lot of drug, a lot of vaccine issues, but we really don't have, we're not developing robust evidence base to support other types of interventions to address the pandemic. Someone seems to be scribbling across my screen, which is lovely. So the other thing is that there's but to go to the exceptionally good, and this is so good that I seem to have the logo twice. I apologize for that. That's a minor glitch. I thought I'd solve that. But the recovery trial led out of Oxford and in the UK is a platform trial testing different interventions for COVID. What I want to highlight is the level of support that recovery got. So the chief medical officers of England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, and the NHS medical director wrote to all doctors, strongly encouraged them to participate in the national randomized trials in COVID-19, of which recovery is one. That level of support and backup by the most senior sort of medical officers and civil servants is, again, unusual and incredibly powerful to try and encourage a research approach. And what that led to is more than 176 hospitals have recruited more than 12,000 hospitalized patients, which accounts for about 15% of the UK, I think, hospitalized cases, which is just spectacular. And recovery gave clear and ambiguous results on death as an outcome, showing that dexamethasone for severe patients reduced death, but also hydroxychloroquine and lopinar and ritonavir do not reduce death. These are remarkably powerful findings, which, because they've been done at such a scale, have changed policy and practice around the world. And one of the other things is they've managed to get a substantial amount of funding from a diverse range of funders. But again, the National Institute of Health Research are a major sort of supporter of this initiative. So good planning, good infrastructure, good networks can lead to very large, ambitious, multi-center trials that can make a difference. Likewise, the WHO created the Solidarity Clinical Trial, which is an international trial, which is basically trying to test interventions. It has a simple, pragmatic design, which was adapted rapidly from a pre-existing core pandemic protocols. This is one of those issues about things that were available that really helped us to move forward quickly. But they did observe, unlike the UK, there were many delays in the participating countries due to their regulatory requirements. But again, they were able to confirm that hydroxychloroquine and lopinar ritonavir were not effective, and they are currently the largest trials of remdesivir and interferon that are ongoing. These kind of initiatives are what we need. And then hopefully just sort of some things in terms of what we can do in the broader community to help. When COVID struck, we very quickly talked to our publisher in trials to basically allow rapid publication with minimum peer review, because we thought transparency was key, of truncated protocols for any COVID-related trials. And there's currently been about 100 protocols, still a relatively small number, that have been sort of basically published, so we get a better sense about what was planned and what's ongoing. Likewise, the COMET initiative has swung into action and are basically doing work at this point in time to develop core outcome sets for trials in people with COVID. So hopefully that will lead to basically convergence on what outcomes are important and how we can move forward. So what about the systematic reviews? What's the good, the bad, and the ugly? I'm going to start off by saying the good is that there was, again, a substantial increase in evidence synthesis and supporting activities in the early months of the pandemic. There's a big pivot for people who started doing systematic reviews that were relevant to COVID topics to try and help support decision-making in their jurisdictions. There are lots of new entrants to the field, which is very, it increased the capacity of the field, but there were kind of a number of issues with them. So a lot of the early work focused on rapid reviews of clinical and public health topics. And these were kind of rapidly became out of date. In the early days of COVID, if you did a rapid review on transmission 2 weeks or 3 weeks later, it was going to be out of date. And there weren't any attempts to try and develop living or systematic reviews or guidelines. These reviews were variable quality and transparency. This was partly because of the resources available, because people wanted ultra rapid reviews, so people cut corners, but also there were a number of people who were relatively new to the field and didn't realize basically the amazing advances in methodology we've made in systematic review methods within the last 20 years. There's a huge duplication of effort, and the discoverability and longevity of rapid reviews was uncertain. And also there were inequities in terms of the capacity to conduct and use this evidence syntheses, particularly in relation to low and middle income countries. We're doing some work as part of an initiative called COVIDN, which I mentioned briefly, but we've identified over 1,700 systematic reviews and rapid reviews have been produced since March. And we've basically classified them by coverage. And whilst we have a lot of reviews that look at some aspect of clinical management, we have really very little to look at sort of the economic and social, which is going to be a really key area in the future. Only 23% of the full reviews had a high AmStar score. So most of them were probably poor quality. Only 9% were living reviews and only 8% of reviews used grade. There's a lot of duplication of effort. The National Coordinating Centre in Canada were doing a rapid review of maternal and fetal risk in COVID in early May and doing a planned update in August, and they found more than 50 reviews on the same topic published in the interval. And if you want to know more, there's a nice sort of article in Science on this. So what are the good though? Well, the COVID NMA is a living network meta-analysis undertaken by colleagues in France, in Cochrane, France, and other colleagues around the world that is going to try and have an ongoing living network meta-analysis of drugs. There is also another Canadian-led group that is doing a living systematic review network meta-analysis, and also a Scandinavian Canadian group doing a living network meta-analysis of drugs for COVID. At one level, this is good. Replication is good, but I do worry that it feels a bit like a London bus. You wait forever for one of them to come along, and then about 10 arrive. And I suspect that what I hope is that basically we won't get any new network meta-analyses being done without very careful justification. At the guidance level, in Australia, there is a national COVID-19 clinical evidence task force, again led by colleagues in Cochrane, Australia, which is providing living guidance for a whole range of topic COVID subjects. There is also WHO looking at drugs, a living guideline, and also shortly to be launched from Cochrane, Canada, basically a COVID-19 recommendation and contextualization project. So these are all really good examples where people are trying to do high quality work. And then again, hopefully in terms of things that have been helpful, the National Institute of Health Research or the Prospero Registry specifically sort of fast track protocols relating to COVID. And we established a network called COVIDEN, which includes 50 of the world's leading evidence synthesis organizations to try and collaborate and cooperate and reduce inappropriate duplication of effort in the evidence synthesis response. I'm going to skip over the next slide, but basically, please go and visit the COVIDEN website. I'll give you the URL at the end because there's lots of resources there. But some final thoughts. In terms of pandemic preparedness, the rapid spread of the pandemic and the responding tsunami of good, bad, and ugly research, I think raises major challenges for evidence-based research. The importance of the pre-pandemic preparedness and infrastructure to support pandemic research cannot be overstated. If we're thinking about RCTs, I think there are opportunities for mid-course corrections in the planning and conducting research as we move from the sprint to the marathon phase to try and improve the signal to noise. So we should be able to sort of basically try and reduce the chaos and noise we had before. So I think for RCTs, we need to return to normal evidence-based practice, using systematic reviews to help planning, use standardized outcome sets, rigorous design, transparent reporting, wherever possible, join international large-scale multi-center trial efforts rather than small-scale home-built research, and make sure we address these major gaps. And likewise, systematic reviews, I think they are essential to help the world both plan future research, but understand the consequences of the current research. So we need to invest in those, but we need to move away from this sort of this very high noise to signal environment with lots of rapid reviews that are out of date, of variable quality, to a high signal to noise phase where we have curated, high quality living evidence syntheses and evidence support initiatives. Again, we need to address major gaps, and we need to work with a broad range of stakeholders globally to make sure that we can coordinate and fund this as we move forward. So yeah, the last slide I've got is I think we need to think about what happens as we come out of this pandemic. And what we should do is start to identify and conduct research which will support decision-making in future pandemics, so the baseline evidence is available for the next outbreak. And we need to build research infrastructure, international networks, and coordinating structures so we're ready to go when the next outbreak begins. So Jenny, just about made it under the wire. So I'm finishing there. Thank you very much. That's my email if you want to contact me, my Twitter account, and also the COVIDEN and also the BESI initiative URLs. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeremy. And I know we have a bit of a challenge, of course, scheduling and all that's going on. So I am actually going to diverge a bit from our plan and ask, there have been some questions in the chat, so we'll pose some questions to you, and if you're able to stay on longer, and we can return to some questions at the end. Would that be okay with you? And just to all the participants as well, but flexibility is key these days. Great. So Jeremy, I'm just going to scroll through, and I guess I will just probably start with the question from Michael Schuschel. Jeremy, do you feel that topping up these, there's also an issue of selective fast track in the sense of papers with original results getting published really quickly, but letters, comments criticizing some of these papers not having the same privilege?
Yes, I think that's a thoughtful comment. I mean, we have journals that like the BMJ that will just automatically put things up if they're there. But you know, there is a challenge that often critiques of trials may not be posted in a timely manner. I think I would say what's been more interesting has been that on Twitter, you end up with sort of post peer review sort of comments on Twitter, and trying to make sense of those has been even more challenging for that. But I think there are. I mean, I think, you know, journals need to think about their response to about how these comments go up, and I think the BMJ is really a journal that's done that for many years, and we need to encourage that kind of rapid publication.
Great, thank you. And just switching a bit to focus on systematic reviews. First question from Ilke Kaplan in Germany. How would you evaluate the use of AmStar for this topic of COVID? Would you say it's an appropriate or helpful tool?
So we're using AmStar as part of the way of developing an inventory for a best evidence syntheses. And what we're trying to do is, we're not trying to give a detailed critique of the study, but say in general, are reviews likely to be high quality and of and likely worth reading, or low quality. So we're using it as a very crude separator out of those into that group. And I think under those circumstances, based on previous work we've done, it probably is kind of quite a reasonable way to sort of broadly say, you know, these things seem to be worthwhile, these things don't. If you look at our inventory of best evidence resources or sources, best evidence syntheses, we're only excluding from listing reviews that have got rapid reviews got an AmStar score of less than 4, which is a pretty low bar. So I think it's fit for purpose, but we would say that anyone using our inventory, this is a way of helping them identify what reviews are worth reading, but they should go and read it and think about the implications for their sector.
Great, thanks. And switching a little bit in terms of the duplication of systematic reviews, and I've had the pleasure of working with the Engaging working group, and I'm actually with Prospero directly and Leslie. But there's been a question from Karen Robinson, our next presenter at Johns Hopkins in the US, regarding duplication of systematic reviews. My experience is that part of the issue is registration. People knowing the register, the delay in postings of protocols on registries, difficulty finding protocols on registries. Any thoughts particular to COVID, or just, you know, again, as we move forward and hopefully do shift out of this pandemic crisis period for evidence-based research in general?
Yeah, no, Karen, it's a really good point. One of the things that happened very early in the pandemic was that Prospero basically pivoted to give priority to publishing COVID reviews. This hugely strained what they could do. Yeah, because there's been about several thousand reviews registered with Prospero, and it was a real stretch for them. So Leslie Stewart and her colleagues in York really deserve a huge credit for that. They don't necessarily publish scoping reviews and don't always publish rapid review registrations, but other colleagues, Maureen Dobbins in the National Coordinating Centre of Methods and Tools in Canada has a way of registering protocols for those areas. But you're right that actually being aware of these registration areas is a challenge. So one of the things that we have on the COVID-N website, we have basically a flow sheet for people thinking about doing a systematic review. And the first thing is make sure it's not been done before. Go and look and see whether it's ready. Yeah, there's a review out there that's finished. There's a review registered in Prospero, and before you think about starting your own review. And we had examples of groups saying, hey, we're thinking about doing a review on this, and we tell them to go and look at Prospero, and they'd get back to us and say, oh, wow, someone's doing this review. We're going to talk to them and work with them. But I think, unlike trial registration, we've not got the same leverage in the research community for systematic review registration, and it's something we really need to work upon. What we will do is, in our inventory of best evidence syntheses, we're now working with Prospero to get a feed from them. So if we don't identify any high quality reviews on a particular topic, but in Prospero there's a registration or an ongoing review, we'll also highlight that, so people get a sense of, are there good reviews out there, or are the reviews are ongoing, and hopefully make a judgment about that. The other thing that we want to do, and I'll wrap up probably after that, is try and encourage basically the development of a core set of living systematic reviews. We think we can probably identify, I don't know what the number is, 200 core living reviews or core topics that if we had living systematic reviews, they might cover 80% of the world's needs for information. We'll still need people to, things pop up, we'll still need new reviews to be done that are contextualized to a certain area. But if we actually had a core set of high quality living reviews, that might again really deter people from having to actually do the review themselves. And hopefully what they could do is spend their efforts trying to interpret and contextualize the review for their jurisdiction, their decision makers.
Thanks. And on the topic of, re-mentioning living reviews, Renee Spijker from the Netherlands has asked, as even rapid reviews take time and results from primary research is coming very quickly and decisions need to be made in a very short time, what cutoff would you suggest would be appropriate for the date of gathered data in a review? Sometimes even a month off could make a big difference. And I know personally from my example, we're almost ready to publish, a review and the next trial comes out. And so sort of that comment about, what's the cutoff? When do you do that?
So it's really tough when an information scientist asks you a question about an information science topic. I mean, the answer is it's also going to change with the content area and where we are in the evolution of our understanding about COVID. So, to some extent, its beauty is in the eye of the beholder. What we're doing in COVID End is we are explicitly tagging the date of the last search, not the date of publication, but the date of last search. So people can look at that and say, this is an area that's relatively slow moving, or, there's not been a lot of movement in the last month, so I can trust this, or this is something that I'm very uncomfortable with, and we need to basically take that forward. The other thing within the living review sector we're trying to do is we're trying to articulate the argument that if something is worthwhile doing a rapid review now, in the COVID world, it's likely it's going to be still an issue of interest for 12, 18, 24 months. We're going to be living with COVID over that period of time. So if you do a rapid review, what are the costs then to upgrade that to a proper systematic review and then to a living review? And I think what we need to do is to say, even where those groups are doing rapid reviews, can we encourage them and encourage funders to take the next steps and start to create fuller reviews that will be more easy to appraise and make sense of, and then living reviews if these are high priority topics. So, I think we should be, wherever possible, trying to get out of the rapid review focus and moving into more substantive reviews, but often they can be built up from existing rapid reviews.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Rennie's just put a great comment in the chat box as well, so thank you, Rennie.
Yeah, and so there have been a few questions come in about the role that EBR has in reducing duplication over time, and you were definitely certainly acknowledged that, and acknowledged sort of the challenges with the rapidness with which evidence is evolving and the speed at which we're trying to do evidence syntheses within COVID and emerging topics. For example, you mentioned the maternal fetal risk example, and so you've certainly pointed out examples of duplication. And so I think some questions are coming through about, could you perhaps elaborate on how, sort of we as an evidence synthesis community researchers can use the EBR approach related specifically to COVID-19. And one thing I guess in particular I am struck by is, with COVID end, we have this repository of almost 1,800 systematic reviews and rapid reviews. Is COVID end, are we planning as a community to look into duplication within that set of reviews?
I think in reality, what happened in the first 6 months of the pandemic was inevitable. The pace of the pandemic, the uncertainties around that, the imperative to do something meant that lots of people jumped into either do primary studies, trials, other things. And also it made it very hard to assert for evidence-based research methods. I think what we need to do, one of my colleagues, John Lavis, says that we're moving from the sprint to the marathon phase. We've gone through the first wave, we've learned a lot about that. That's already meant that in the second wave, we're doing things differently. But we're going to be living with COVID, even if we get a vaccine, for at least 24, 36 months, I think. And I think one of the issues that this community can do is reassert the need for good evidence-based research practices. And one of the ways also we can do that, I think, is by starting to demonstrate that we're using meta-epidemiological studies, what happened during this noisy phase of the pandemic. And I think I would have thought that if we do this carefully, you'll be able to identify duplication of effort, people starting trials when we already knew what the answer was, people doing trials of things that have got no biological plausibility, problems in the conduct of trials, and problems in the delays of moving forward with them. So I think one of the things that we need to do in the census community, and to some extent COVID and Cochrane and WHO are currently writing a position paper to articulate some of these things, but we need to do it in the primary research, is basically re-articulate the fundamental soundness of an evidence-based research approach to avoid doing harm, to efficiently use that $3.3 billion worth of funding. My guess is when we go back and look at that, a lot of that will be waste, and Paul Glasio has written about that in the BMJ. So I think now we need the leadership of this community to say, hey, now we can start to do things better. And also I think the examples of recovery and solidarity give a very clear roadmap of what research is needed, and not a sort of a 50-patient trial in my individual hospital.
Great, thank you, Jeremy. So we will move on to Dr. Karen Robinson. Jeremy, if you're able to stay with us, that's wonderful. If not, we'll make sure you get perhaps just the feedback of some of the questions that maybe did come through that we didn't get time to address, but I think we tried to do a good job of getting to most of them. So, and thank you to everyone for all of your wonderful questions.
I'm going to stay for Karen.
Great. So it's my pleasure. Again, I have the lovely opportunity of chairing this session with two wonderful colleagues and friends. So my next colleague and friend that I get to introduce is Dr. Karen Robinson. Dr. Robinson is professor in the Department of Medicine at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, with joint appointments in the Department of Epidemiology and Health Policy and Management at the university's Bloomberg School of Public Health. She is the director of the Johns Hopkins University Evidence-Based Practice Center within the EPC program, and serves as an associate editor on the Method Steering Committee. Dr. Robinson conducts systematic reviews and research on the use of evidence in making decisions. For over 20 years, she has been an active member of Cochrane and is currently an editor for 2 review groups, including the Methodology Review Group. Within the editor of these groups, she serves on the Guidelines International Network, and she's also a founding member of our Evidence-Based Research Network Steering Committee. So Karen, thank you for being here with us today, and looking forward to hearing what you have to share with our community.
thank you to the organizers for inviting me to give this keynote. It is an honor to be giving one of the last talks of the first evidence-based research conference. I also find it somewhat daunting to be pre-recording this talk, and not only because I apparently find it difficult to repeatedly say evidence-based research. It is a disadvantage to not have the opportunity to hear the presentations, to have discussions over coffee, and to really get a feel for and ideally build on the buzz at the conference. I'm going to make some assumptions about what you've heard over the last 2 days, but I would also like to congratulate those who have stayed. Unlike at an in-person conference, I assume you haven't had to run off to catch a flight, but 2 days of video or Zoom talks is a commitment, and I congratulate you for sticking around. You may notice that I tweaked the title a little bit from what was provided. Rather than speak about the future of evidence-based research, I would like to talk about how we can make evidence-based research a part of the future. I would like to start with a very brief history of evidence-based research. I think that the first use of the term evidence-based research was in my dissertation in 2009, where it seemed obvious to me that if we now expect healthcare decisions to be made based on evidence, we should have the same expectation for decisions about healthcare research. My dissertation looked at the use of prior trials using the citation of prior trials as a marker. And I think you saw this figure earlier from Hans, but to just summarize one of the main findings, in my data set, I found that trials cited on average 2 prior trials on the same topic, regardless of how many prior trials there had been on that topic. This work was published and garnered some attention in 2011, including from the press. And I'd also like to point out that work that I completed with colleagues here in developing a framework to identify gaps using systematic reviews, also published in 2011, was the first use of the term evidence-based research in a paper, and I think the first time evidence-based research was used as an author-provided keyword. Speeding up the brief history, in April 2014, I met Hans, and in December of 2014, the EBR network had its inaugural meeting in Bergen. And then, of course, EVBRES started, and of course, the first evidence-based conference. So all fairly recent history. However, the notion of the need for considering prior research is not that new. Here is an early cumulative meta-analysis, and you will see that several trials randomizing many patients to placebo were conducted after 1975, when arguably the answer was already known. This result prompted Chalmers and Lau to call out those subsequent trials as unethical and to call for the completion of a systematic review prior to the start of a new trial. Jump forward many years, and unfortunately not much has changed. A master's student updating my dissertation work found that there was no difference between the 2004 and the 2011 dataset results. That is, more than 75% of prior similar trials were ignored. Even more recently, a recent doctoral grad and an incoming postdoc with me examined the issue of redundant trials, specifically focusing on Chinese trials. In this figure, the bottom left red bars show that thousands of people had been participants in trials about statins conducted outside of China. The red arrow indicates 2007, when recommendations about the use of statins were published in clinical practice guidelines. Considering then 2008 forward, there were more than 2,000 trials conducted, randomizing close to 90,000 patients to placebo, resulting in an estimate of more than 4,000 unnecessary events, including more than 500 deaths. This work of characterizing the extent of the problem and assessing the consequences of not using an evidence-based research approach is important and was included as the initial steps of the 7 steps outlined by the Toronto Plan as part of the research agenda for the Evidence-Based Research Network. These first 3 steps are what could be called meta-research or research about research. And meta-research is important for laying the foundation and providing the rationale for evidence-based research, but we need to move beyond meta-research for evidence-based research to be a part of the future. There is a danger of conflating evidence-based research with meta-research, of limiting evidence-based research to, quote, just about meta-research. In fact, a search on Wikipedia for evidence-based research results in a redirect to the entry for meta-science, where the entry further notes that meta-science, meta-research, and evidence-based research are synonyms. Evidence-based research needs to be clear about what it is and what counts as evidence-based research. Here, perhaps we can learn from the development of evidence-based medicine. From a term introduced in 1990, a grassroots organization starting in 1993, talking here, of course, of Cochrane, to EBM now being an expectation, an expected part of current practice in healthcare. One way to learn from EBM may be to look at the critiques of evidence-based medicine. In a paper in 2000, Strauss and McAllister identified critiques of evidence-based medicine in the health literature and distilled the arguments into limitations and misperceptions. I don't know about you, but several of these sound very similar to criticisms I have heard about evidence-based research. Criticisms such as, you will limit the researcher's creativity, or we don't know how to do this, and even if we did, we don't have the time. I won't go through each of these, but I would like to suggest how evidence-based research should address some of these. First, the notion that evidence-based research stifles research freedom in limiting what is considered. For evidence-based medicine, the generally accepted definition makes it clear that the use of best available evidence needs to be integrated with clinical expertise and patient factors, including values and preferences. We should similarly broaden the definition of evidence-based research to acknowledge the need to integrate other factors along with the systematic use of existing evidence. We provided this broader definitional perspective in the recent series in JCE, but I think this needs to be codified more explicitly. Evidence-based research, like evidence-based medicine, has also been criticized as requiring skills researchers may not have, as well as resources. Like evidence-based medicine, the challenges in practicing evidence-based research include a large and growing body of evidence, needed specific skills and competencies in systematically considering existing evidence, and resources, so time and money. I recall an early Cochrane meeting, Oslo, 1995, and Dave Sackett describing what Cochrane was trying to do as like building a plane that is already in the air. He didn't mean a paper airplane, but paper does reflect the reality at that time. Those of us who have been conducting systematic reviews for a while, I won't say that we're old, recall stacks of printouts of articles, along with stacks of printed data extraction forms, hand completed, maybe with some post-it notes added in. Doing a systematic review is a lot of work. And that's why the recognition of these challenges is why the second aim for the evidence-based research network came about. That is, in addition to promoting no new studies without systematic review of existing evidence, we aim to promote efficient production of systematic reviews. As an example of trying to meet this aim, we participated in the development of the Vienna Principles in 2015 and the start of the international collaboration for the automation of systematic reviews. We also need to move beyond the development of tools for systematic review to embracing and determining the fit for evidence-based research within the ever-evolving digital ecosystem. As an example, I have previously been involved in a project that was called Zeopub, about developing computable publishing based on reporting guidelines. And I'm currently participating in the COVID-19 Knowledge Accelerator, or COCA initiative, working primarily on the digitally structured data that is the center of the evidence ecosystem. One thing to think about is, where should evidence-based research fit in this system? How do we become part of this system? Another way to mitigate the challenge of lack of skills or competencies to practice evidence-based research is the development of guidance documents and training programs. Cochrane, for instance, developed a handbook for the conduct of systematic reviews, and EVBRES, specifically Work Group 2, is developing a handbook for the conduct of evidence-based research. Perhaps most importantly, for evidence-based research to play a role in the future, we need to work to change the current climate or culture of research. And I think this really starts with the young or newer investigators. We should ensure that evidence synthesis is an accepted and expected component of PhD programs, and that the EBR approach is part of research training. We also need to engage research ethics boards, or IRBs. The entire ethical basis for research requires the use of existing evidence. Ethics boards need to uphold these standards. Also, in a similar way to engaging with patients to expect evidence-based medicine from their physicians, we need to find a way to inform patients so that they expect to see evidence-based research in any study. Details of the value of the study based on evidence-based research should at a minimum be included on consent forms. Speaking of the value of a study, funding agencies should expect that those seeking funding for a new study provide justification for the new study based on the EBR approach. Is this study worthwhile? We also need to change the culture at the end of studies, at the stage of publication. Just as journals now mandate that trials should be registered, journal editors and reporting guidelines should ensure that the justification for starting the trial is clear and that the new results are placed in the context of existing evidence. This is not uniformly mandated or enforced. How do we ensure that evidence-based research is a part of the future? First, it is important to characterize the extent and consequences of the problem, but we now need to move beyond meta-research. We need to broaden the definition of evidence-based research to recognize the role of the interests and skills of researchers, as well as the patient and end user circumstances. We need to address the limitations or barriers, such as lack of time and skills, through training, and be promoting the efficient production and dissemination of evidence. Finally, we need to work to change the culture of research through training newer researchers and working with ethics boards, journals, and funding agencies so that, like EBM is now, evidence-based research becomes expected. Again, I'd like to thank you for the invitation to talk at this, the first evidence-based research conference. I hope in future conferences we will be discussing how evidence-based research has become an accepted and expected part of the research landscape. And I also hope that we get to have these conversations in person. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen, for a wonderful presentation. We have some questions for you, and I see Jeremy has been able to stay with us too, so I think there's a few questions that will apply to both of you as well. One of the questions, Karen, that came up was about special training for young researchers. And we know within FBRIS, we have our training schools, but can you speak to other opportunities for training that you know of that are available, or what training opportunities should actually include and be focused on for young researchers in an EBR approach?
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. I'm not aware of too many training schools like the one that Miloslav described yesterday. I think for me, the key part is to ensure that the training is integrated within the existing educational structure. So for example, I think we had a little back and forth yesterday about the need for medical students or trainee clinicians, when they are taking their course on research training, EBR should be part of that research course. It should be part of that, integrated with that. Likewise, I think it needs to be integrated within PhD programs. I think as we've discussed yesterday and today, too often we're kind of banging our heads against the wall that systematic reviews and meta research should count in PhDs. And I think beyond that, they should be expected in PhDs. I think everybody should learn how to do a systematic review, for example.
Thanks, Karen. You're getting some amens from Robin Christensen. I guess speaking a little bit more about the topic of challenges, there was a question, actually more of a comment about that some countries have not even adopted EBM, or evidence-based medicine. Yes. So could you perhaps just speak to, is that really a challenge for evidence-based research that countries haven't adopted evidence-based medicine, or, are they intertwined? Are they different? Can you speak to that? That'd be great.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's actually a topic that I thought about putting into the presentation. And that is that clearly you can see it with EBM, the same sort of diffusion of EBR across different countries and also within different disciplines or fields. Give a very specific example, the United States was much slower to adopt EBM than other countries like the UK, for example. I don't know what the solution to that is. I think getting a sort of a critical mass and changing expectations really is what we need. And eventually those other countries like the US, hopefully, will catch up.
Thanks, Karen. And a question about artificial intelligence. So what role will artificial intelligence, for example, OpenAI's GPT-3, do you think will play in the future in relation to evidence-based research and systematic reviews?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think one of the exciting things, one of the opportunities that's come out of the crisis that is COVID, is that there's been an increased attention and motivation on making trials and trial reports and evidence synthesis more computable, more efficient. And I'm hoping that that's something that will continue. Because some of us have been working on that for decades and not getting too far. What it's not clear to me, and I alluded to this a little bit in the talk, and I wasn't sure what Jeremy was going to cover, is if you think about that digital ecosystem, the diagram I showed came from Magic, which is a group looking at clinical decision making or clinical decision support tools, is to think a little bit more clearly, where do we fit? And I think we talked about this a little bit with Jeremy, is when you're having rapid production of trials and rapid production of reviews, how do we insert ourselves into that cycle? And I don't know if Jeremy has any additional, if he's still there, has any additional thoughts on that.
Jeremy, thoughts?
I have to confess, with the evidence ecosystem, I'm much more involved in the implementation side of it. And one of the issues is that I think we have an oversimplified view about what implementation requires. And if you somehow just sort of stick evidence into computer systems, the world will be a better place. Whereas we know from systematic reviews, the world will be a 6% better place, but there's still going to be large gaps. So I think there are opportunities to improve efficiency in terms of the knowledge generation, knowledge collection, knowledge synthesis components of the ecosystem. And I think one of the things we need to do post-COVID is learn what we can and try and articulate a new model, which will be better from the rather siloed version we have at the moment. But I still think there's going to be a major issue about how do we actually then make sure we get changes in practice to serve the needs of citizens around the world.
I was muted, my apologies. So both for Karen and Jeremy, I think it would be really great if we could just sort of revisit the comment that Renee posted, the discussion point about evidence-informed research versus evidence-based research. Jeremy, I know you did comment in the chat, but I think it'd be helpful if to just have a little bit of a discussion. So Renee's discussion point was evidence-based or evidence-informed research. The first would imply only evidence will determine your research. The other gives room for more reasons to determine the research conducted. This would be similar to the James Lund Alliance priority, determining methods. So Karen, perhaps to you first about that, and then over to Jeremy for his thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. I think, looking back, when I called it evidence-based research, I really was thinking in lines with evidence-based medicine, and that is using evidence to inform decisions, just different sorts of decisions. But I certainly get your point. And I'm not sure if it's simply semantics or if there is a key difference there. But I will say I just used evidence-based research because it was part of that whole evidence-based movement, I guess, if you will. But perhaps that word is also overused and certainly is used in weird ways sometimes.
Thanks, Karen. Jeremy, thoughts from you?
Yeah, so I kind of probably fairly early on moved away from evidence-based medicine to evidence-informed, or evidence-based decisions to evidence-informed decisions. And it was largely a response that, particularly if you're working with policymakers, but even clinicians, they would say there are a range of factors that actually influence their decisions, and evidence is only one input. And there's a kind of, there's actually a reaction against evidence-based decision-making, because it felt like somehow this was a linear, the evidence says this, we should do that. Now, none of the evidence-based medicine, champions ever said that, but it is an easy sort of jab. Whereas evidence-informed, where I think the argument is what you're trying to do is make sure that evidence is part of the decision-making process, was a much easier sell. And in the chat box, I was trying to, after Renee's comment, I was trying to reflect, because I think in the evidence space, there's certainly the standard procedures that should be the norm. So using syntheses of evidence to plan future research, prospective registration, open science frameworks, transparency, robust designs. But I'm also aware that when I design a study, I make a whole lot of decisions, and the science of I'm often trying to balance what does the meta-epidemiological science say about the design of a study with the reality of trying to go and say randomize these hospitals or clinics. So I kind of wonder whether at one level the evidence-informed or language is better, but it's also a bit more convoluted. So I kind of think that the leaders, I can live with both, and I'm very happy to sort of say, yes, we should promote evidence-based research. I think it is, but like clinical and policy decision-making, as a researcher, I bring a lot more to the table than just the evidence about how to do a certain piece of a certain research activity.
Yeah, and I think there's some benefit to sort of sticking with evidence-based, because people, even outside of the choir, knows what that means. So, for example, in thinking about making patients advocates for evidence-based research, they now know what evidence-based medicine is, or evidence-based healthcare. So it's a easier extension to say, well, if you're going in, if somebody's asking you to go into trial, that should also be evidence-based. And so I think using the same language is helpful.
Thanks to you both. And sort of continuing on the topic of, you know, the EBR, EBM, there's been a question about could you provide a take home for African universities where evidence-based research seems to be a new paradigm? I also think in our experience collectively, it's not just African universities where EBR seems to be a new paradigm. So sort of, you know, take-home messages in terms of that you could think of in terms of that.
Yeah.
Or reactions to that comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, it's similar to you know, the adoption of evidence-based medicine by different countries and also different disciplines. You know, surgery was notoriously slow to accept evidence-based medicine. I'm not sure there's an easy answer to that. I do think we can look to the implementation scientists and you know, diffusion of ideas, theories and ideas, and you know, so think about having key opinion leaders lobby for inclusion of EBR as part of educational programs, for example. And I think as EBR, as we think about moving in the future, we do need to think a little bit more about how do we implement EBR, how do we disseminate that, and also, and we've had some discussions about this, but also more discussions about, well, how do we also monitor or evaluate the uptake of EBR? I think we're still relatively new. We haven't really thought that through, but if we're thinking about the future, we need to also think about that.
Thanks, Karen. Robin Christensen actually had a bit of a discussion point, but a bit of a question at the same time, so I'll pose that. So at this meeting, we should be cautious not to make it sound too easy, meaning there might be PICO evidence that looks satisfying, looks like it's satisfying a specific question, or it actually turns out the patients are slightly different, or the drug is not just from the same class. And then Robin goes on, sorry, I'm scrolling down, I apologize. This is the, how rigorous do we need to be from an evidence-based research point of view?
Yeah, as I said briefly in my typed response to Robin, I mean, I think this is a common comment or criticism of this type of meta research that identifies redundant trials or trials that might be considered wasteful or unethical. It's also has been heard in criticisms of evidence-based healthcare or evidence-based medicine that we are lumping together trials that aren't similar enough. That we need to consider subgroups and other populations, for example. That was also a concern with some work I did with Paul Glazio about is it really fair to say that the subsequent trials were redundant, or were they different enough? But I think even if they're different, they should still consider the existing evidence that was relevant, so similar trials. So they should still, in their justification, state why their trial in a different population or in a slightly intervention applied in a slightly different way is justified. They should base that justification on existing evidence.
Thanks, Karen. And as you were speaking, a specific question related to the same topic came through for Jeremy. And so I'll just, let me just find that. Give me 1 second. Sorry, so many questions coming through. It's wonderful. Jeremy, a question was posed. If a life-saving intervention was only supported and shown to be effective on large case series, and there's no RCT or systematic reviews conducted in this particular area, can we still use this intervention in our different patient populations?
So somebody asked me that privately, and I responded. I've just kind of pasted the response back into the chat. My concern is that if we were happy to deal with case studies or case series, we'd be assuming that hydroxychloroquine was effective. It appears to be it appears to be ineffective and potentially harmful. So, if we are happy to take the evidence from observational studies, there's real danger that we will mislead ourselves and do harm to our patients, because the large RCTs, Recovery Solidarity, both showed this was not the case. So we need RCT evidence to inform policy and practice. If we over-report and interpret observational studies, it hinders our ability to do RCTs, because people will no longer agree to be randomized because they think it works. The mentor that I talked about very early on, Adrian Grant, used to say he wasn't bright enough, he wasn't clever enough to do observational studies. And I completely agree with him. I'm not clever enough to do an observational study because they are so hard to do them well. And most of them are done abysmally, and they have a real danger that they will actually mislead us. So we should, particularly where decisions have real consequences for patients, really insist on trials. Observational studies might justify the need for trial, but we need to do high quality trials.
Karen, any comment to that? And there's also another question for you if you don't have a comment, but just.
No, I was reading another question for me. Sorry, I was a little distracted.
Oh, okay.
Is that the one from Clara?
So from our dear friend Clara Brunhuber, Karen, in the future, what role do you think national, international bodies will and should play for ensuring that research becomes fully evidence-based?
Yeah, so I'm not sure what is meant by bodies. I don't know if you want to clarify that now, but I do think this is sort of carrot and stick thoughts about diffusion, right? So registration to clinical trials is a great example. It really didn't take off until there was the stick of you can't publish in these major medical journals unless you register your trial. So if that counts as an international body, journals, then definitely they need to play a role. I also think that ethics bodies, which tend not to, ethics boards, which tend not to be national or international, but they play a key role. And then I'm not sure what other sort of societies or organizations. Yeah, I think it would be great if, oh, so sorry for people who aren't seeing in the chat, it's been clarified, governments, WHO, European and international societies. I mean, yeah, wouldn't it be great if international societies, WHO, signed on to a statement about the need for EBR? And maybe Hans wants to comment on this, the ongoing efforts to have government agencies and funding bodies make such statements.
One comment I would make is that, they are government bodies, but funders are key drivers of what we do. Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I'm applying for a funding application, I will do what they ask me to do. Researchers are very good at jumping over hoops to do this stuff. And so I think we should be working with funders. There's been some traction. So, so the UK MRC, CHR, various others require systematic reviews to justify a new trial. And certainly CHR used to have a structured application form, which required you to address things like blinding and allocation, concealment, etc. But I think we should be targeting research funders. They interestingly often feel nervous about asking their research community to do stuff, but they're funding good science. If they're not going to, if they're not going to insist on good science, then they're wasting the money that societies give them to do that. So I think we should be going hell for leather for funders. And then we need to find ways of supporting the research community so they know what is meant by evidence-based research. there's a big move in the basic science world to do this, like by people like Malcolm McLeod and Mara Richards-Hofinger. But that there's a big education component there. Whereas I think in the kind of applied world, we're in a bit more of a, hopefully we know a bit more about design as a basic sort of idea.
Thanks. And another question has come up about the overlap and or distinctions between evidence-based research and implementation science or implementation. So Karen or Jeremy, if one of you wanted to react to that comment. Thoughts?
The overlap?
Yeah, well, overlaps or distinctions. So is there overlap? Is there not over? Are they distinct?
Well, I certainly think of implementation science as distinct from EBR, but EBR needs to learn from implementation science, as I noted before, in terms of how we try to get EBR adopted and adapted for use in different fields in different countries. I'm not sure how there would be an overlap. Maybe I'm not understanding the question completely. To me, you could also argue, I don't know if this is what the questioner was getting at, that as we talked about earlier today, EBR, I think, should be applied to all research, including implementation science research, not just health research.
Yeah, and I think, Jeremy, I've heard you speak before about that, even just specifically in terms of audit and feedback as an implementation science, implementation strategy. So I don't know if you have thoughts.
Yeah, well, first of all, I completely agree with Karen that EBR principles should inform implementation science, because we need to make sure the implementation science is high quality. One of the things, I've been over the years having many conversations with people like David Mower, whose office is next door to me when I'm in Ottawa. And I think implementation science has a series of lenses and tools that might be helpful as one way of starting to look at the problem. What implementation science is not used to, though, is that normally implementation scientists are often thinking about patient behaviors, clinician behaviors, clinical environments. And I think in the EBR sphere, the people that you're trying to influence are the people we've been talking about. So, government agencies, funders, ethics boards, other things. And so I worry sometimes that there's a kind of implementation science cannot solve the problem. What we've got are a range of tools that would be helpful, I think, in helping articulate the problem, think about what solutions might be, but it needs people who are really experienced people in the EBR world, in the funding world, to then think about, well, what does that mean? What are the constraints on funders, which are going to be very different to the constraints on a hospital CEO or to a patient. So I think implementation science should be at the table and can be helpful, but we shouldn't overestimate what it can do. And it's going to need implementation science with the EBR community and those stakeholder groups to try and get some sort of traction.
Great, thank you. And as we're gearing to the close of just a few moments left, I am going to pose the final comment to both of you, and I'll leave it up to which of you wants to respond first, who needs a little bit more time. But if you could leave, this is the last session of our conference, so it would be wonderful if you had words of wisdom as to, what are the is the main priority or the top few priorities for evidence-based research as we move forward.
Karen?
Do you want me? We're looking at each other.
Do you like how I didn't call one of you out? No.
Yeah. Well, I'm sitting here thinking I don't know if what I would add beyond the sort of the last slide in my talk. I mean, I do think as much as meta research is really important, and I certainly enjoy doing it, we do need to move beyond that. And I think there's some specific ways we can do that, and we've made some inroads in that. I really do think it's important to engage patients, for example, And, you know, I think about Q and the consumers within the Cochrane groups and so forth, and really working with them to make sure that any new trial that started or new study that started of human subjects is really based on evidence. I think that's one of the key ways forward is to, if you make it an expectation of the potential trial participants, the funding agencies, the research ethics boards, I think is a key here in the US. And then the journals, I think that's really how we move this forward.
So the only thing I agree, implementation is I think the key issue. Karen will remember that in the early days of Cochrane, Muir Gray used to have a shtick about using the guide to how the Jesuits wanted to go out and convert the world. And there are 10 steps. I can't remember all of them, but I remember number 10, which is sometimes you have to die. So I think we should go and try and get implementation and keep going, because it's a scandal that we're still doing crap research in the 21st century. So it's the implementation, and we should go back and try and resurrect that Muir Gray 10 points, Karen, and work out how that applies to this issue. But I suspect number 10 will still be sometimes we have to die. And Hannah is ready for that. I can see that she's ready for that.
Well, thank you. A round of applause and gratitude to both Karen and Jeremy for being here with us this morning. Over for all of us, we're all on the other side of the hemisphere. So it's morning for us. So we thank you for joining us this morning, this evening, this night. And it's now my pleasure to turn the conference over briefly to Dr. Miloslav Klugar, who's the director and founder of the Czech National Center for Evidence-Based Healthcare and Knowledge Translation, and its pillars, which are the Cochrane Czech Republic, the Czech Republic EBHC Center, and the JBI Center of Excellence and Masaryk University Grade Center. Miloslav's also an adjunct associate professor of public health at the Faculty of Health and Medical Sciences at the University of Adelaide, Australia. So Miloslav, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Jenny. Hello, everyone. It's good to see still quite high numbers in the end for the conference. Well, my word was about the Global Evidence Summit, as we are very proud that we were elected as a host for 2021 for the Global Evidence Summit. However, as you know, the situation with the COVID-19 pandemic, this is the reason why we are not in Denmark and we are here online, which is great to see all of you. However, we are considering with all partners now that perhaps the Global Evidence Summit would be postponed to 2023. However, this is still not the official communication, as the official communication from all partners, which are Cochrane, JBI, Campbell, and Gin, will come, I think, in a week time. So please bear with us. And we are thinking about the best solution to be safe and to be responsible regarding the COVID-19 pandemics. So the communication and update regarding the Global Evidence Summit will come within the week time.
Thank you, Miloslav. And thank you again for being here and all that you've done for FBRACE and our EBR network behind the scenes. And now it's my pleasure to turn back over to one of our fearless leaders, Dr. Hans Lund, with another announcement.
Yes, I have an important announcement. First of all, based upon the very nice strategy laid forward by Karen, the issues identified by the FBRACE cost action, and not at least the long chat conversation during both yesterday and today. And I can tell you that the people behind arranging all these technical issues in this online conference, they had never seen so many comments and questions and remarks in any conference before. So this is really showing us the need for a second EBR conference. And I would like just to share with you a little some information here. We have decided that the conference should take place at the 27th to the 28th of September 2021. And we don't care about COVID-19 because we can either do it in person or online. Of course, we don't know yet, but if we are going to have an in-person conference, we will have a lot of benefits, one of which could be that you as a participant could submit suggestions not only for abstract presentations or orals, posters, but also for workshops and special sessions. If we are going to have it online, we know that we can do it. We know it can be done. We have a very good experience here. So no matter what, we will have a conference in the 27th to the 28th of September 2021. We will be fair and let you know that we, of course, will ask for a conference fee because we need to support the activities going on, but we will definitely make sure that it will be a fair one, only what is absolutely needed, so as many as possible from all around the world is able to join us. So thank you very much for 2 very fantastic days, and I'm really looking forward to see you all next year.
Thank you, Hans. And on to our one of our other fearless leaders of the EBR conference, Dr. Maritta Valimaki. And I would like to bring her back to the forefront to provide some closing remarks for the conference before we officially close it. Maritta.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. Sorry that you cannot see me because like yesterday, today I have even weaker internet access. So I just would like to say a few words in the last moment. First, I would like to say that this has been a wonderful conference. I sincerely hope that all of you have enjoyed the last 2 days of debate and networking. And discussions like this are very important, and they have given us inspiration and new thoughts for the future. I am also sure that based on the presentations and discussions, all of us can contribute to solve different issues in evidence-based research in our countries. Even though the contribution may be small, but it is still a valuable step for the future, as we have actually heard these two presentations today. Therefore, on the behalf of the scientific and organization committees, I would like to thank the amazing keynote speakers and abstract presentations. Thank you for delivering such inspiring thoughts. We have learned a lot from you, and I'm sure that all of us have something unique to take back home. Presentations have been delivered with help of chairs, vice chairs, and gatekeepers of each session. Thanks to all. You have done outstanding job. Thank you very much. There have also been a group of invisible support persons like Tale, Helen, and Lund at the Western Norway University of Applied Sciences. I have to say that without your help and support, we could not run the conference. You have made this conference real. Thank you for your amazing contribution. I would also like to thank our audience around the world, all of you who have joined our first evidence-based research conference. It has been a privilege to host you during these 2 days. And lastly, I would like to thank the members of the scientific and organization committees. With your expertise, experience, innovative ideas, and helping hands together with the support from the COST Association, and of course, the member country organizations, we would not be able to develop such an inspiring conference program. So, with these words, let me once again express my sincere thanks to all of you for coming together and contributing for our conference. Usually, I would wish all of you a safe trip back to home. But now I say you, be safe at home. Thank you and see you soon again. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Maritta, for those wonderful words of thank you and inspiring words about the conference. It is my pleasure on behalf of all attendees, all of the speakers, all of those behind the scenes, to thank you for your amazing leadership over the past months. Without you, this conference would not have been possible. You are an amazing leader, and we thank you from the bottom of our hearts for all that you have done for EVBRACE and this conference. So if everyone will please join me in a virtual round of applause to thank Maritta. Thank you. And I don't think I could say it any better than Maritta already has. So I will only just say, it is my pleasure to close this first evidence-based research conference. Thank you all.